This is the Innovation Ecosystem Panel. This will really be our first year where we've picked a topic to address or a segment to address this topic, because we thought the timing was right. And I think, frankly, there's a whole lot more we could talk about than the hour we have, but we're going to use the time we have really well. And you might think about this as our venture capital panel, and you might wonder why we didn't call it that. And I would say we use the term innovation ecosystem to really suggest a broader lens for you to think about as you look at these opportunities and challenges to come. It's more than just venture capital, it's innovation ecosystem. We all know that technology in all its different forms has become one of the great forces for change, growth, and disruption in the 21st century, and even in the latter part of the 20th century. We also know that this is where the greatest wealth generation has happened over our last generation, including, think about some of the icon names that we're all familiar with, like Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, Uber. And frankly, there's many more than that that we don't know the names of that were part of that process. In fact, I was fascinated to see recently that there's actually more billionaires in Beijing than in New York today. And there are actually more billionaires in China than in the US today. So many of us don't know the names of where those billions came from. But in any case, innovation in all its forms is our future. So we need to talk about it more, think about it more. And one of the reasons we wanted to bring this topic here is that as investors, as business owners, as regional leaders, the question really is, how should we think about this space? How might we participate to keep up? And how should we participate to be sure we don't miss out, either as an investor or as a business leader or as a regional leader in our own community? So with that preview, let me introduce our panel. And I really want to start off with Russ and let him carry it from there. But I've said to Russ in several times, and he keeps getting very sheepish about this, but that in most every way, Russ Capper is the ideal moderator for this panel. He feels like I'm setting him up. But he really is the ideal moderator for this panel. He is a serial entrepreneur, which I think his wife gets nervous about, but he is. The multiple tech startups he's been involved in. He was a founder of High Drive TV, a digital video network. And he now serves as executive director of Houston Exponential, which many of you are familiar with. Some of you from out of town may not be. HX was really formed several years ago. It was formed as combining the existing initiatives that were in place within the Greater Houston Partnership, as well as within the mayor's office. All that was combined and rolled into the long-standing, at that point, Houston Technology Center to create one entity to really drive a lot of the innovation activities, support and otherwise here in Houston. So Russ is the executive director of that effort, and as such is the perfect moderator for this panel. So with that, let me turn it over to Russ and say thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. How many of you have heard of Houston Exponential? Okay, pretty good. Hopefully when I finish there will be more. So it's kind of interesting what Houston did. I had trouble defending the fact that Houston is an innovative city. I think if you ignored what we've done with moonshots and building dome stadiums and cardiology and cancer cure and even horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, take those off, maybe we're not very innovative. But we're very innovative here. However, there's this sector that has become very important these days for fast growth. And that's being able to have, an environment, an ecosystem that works very well for fast-growing digital technology companies. And we definitely need help in that category, and that's what Houston Exponential does. Just talk about changing paradigms. I can't help but think on the companies that I started, there weren't these things called incubators. There weren't accelerators. There just barely were elevators. But we still started companies back then. But our panel today, this is really cool. We've been able to be together a couple of times, and this is real unique. A broad spectrum presentation venture capital in 2019. Down on the end is Blair, Garrou, who is the co-founder and managing director of Mercury Fund, Houston's premier venture capital firm. Next to him, David Schubert, the chief operating partner with Accelerator Life Sciences. David has spent a lot of time in Houston, and we're thinking we're going to have him spend a lot more time. Next to him is Kirsten Morin, who is the co-head of global venture capital at Aberdeen Standard Investments. She's also an ex-IBMer. I have some of that in my background, and a graduate of Babson, which is just unbelievable. And next to her is Peter Lawrence, also the co-head of global venture at Aberdeen Standard Investments. In fact, up first, out of the ordinary panel, actually Peter is going to give us a presentation about the shifting paradigms in venture capital. Peter?
Hey, thanks, Russ. I appreciate it. We're going to swap name tags for a second. So thank you, everybody. After the last panel, it's a little tough to follow that act, but we're going to have a little fun today. We're talking about ecosystems and paradigm shifts and all sorts of big words. I think the real point of it, from our perspective, is that we don't want to sound sort of highfalutin and boring. We're going to try to have a little fun with it. We are going to take a look at what's driving venture capital, broadly speaking, globally today. We're going to get into some more localized issues too on this panel. But we're going to start there. We're going to look at sort of where capital is coming from to fund startups in the marketplace today, where that capital is going, and what the implications might be for Houston, frankly. So that's where we're going to start. And if I can work this properly. There we go. Venture capital feeds on change. So I think the title of this panel is important, and the title of the day is important. It thrives on change. It revels in paradigm shifts. It performs its best when it's funding truly creative destruction in established industries. So, not surprisingly, it targets information technology companies and life sciences companies. And the question is why? Well, that's because that's where most of the really truly innovative developments are occurring. So today, we're going to look at not only some of the areas that are pretty interesting to the venture capital space, but we're also going to focus on sort of the venture capital model itself and how it has morphed over the last decade. And we'll probably get to the point where, at least in some regard, an investor in the venture space would say, the more things change, frankly, the more they stay the same. But let's start here. Who in this room does not have one of these items in their pocket or in their pocketbook, or more likely in your hand right now? Nobody. That's what I thought. So it's really tricky for speakers, and usually I'm sitting out there on that side. You're either doing texts or emails, or you're playing words with friends, and enjoy it. And once in a while, just pick your head up so we know that you're still awake. The headline on this slide is a PC in your pocket. Frankly, that's not a very fair comparison, in my opinion. What you're looking at is so much more than that. It's your primary communications, entertainment, shopping, navigation, socializing, picture taking, transportation arranging. Give up your personal privacy magic trick right there in your hand every day. It even gets to talk back to you when you talk to it. It's amazing what it does for us. It's changed our lives. The point of that is that this has only happened since 2007. We're in our 12th year of having this in our pocket. In 2007, we jumped a platform. We went from being locked into a PC on our desks to an instrument that is completely mobile and almost available to us anytime and almost anywhere in the world. We can contact anyone individually in the world. And in fact, it's just remarkable to me to know that while there are downsides with this technology, and while there are downsides with us becoming addicted to this technology, more than 2/3 of humanity was already signed up and owned one of these things a year or so ago. It's probably well beyond that at this point. How's that for a paradigm shift? We're talking about paradigm shifts in technology. And by the way, it certainly wasn't lost on the public markets. If you look back 10 years ago, there was only one technology company on the list of the 10 largest companies in the globe. The other companies were truly energy, way to go, Houston, and banking and industrials. Fast forward 10 years, 7 of the top 10 global companies today are the Microsofts and all of their companies in the technology giants category. So what's happened in that 10 years? Well, software is eating the world. So says Mark Andreessen, who was the founder of Netscape, if you remember that company, but also a co-founder of one of the most important venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. He ought to know. What he meant by that is that computing and network infrastructure have become commoditized. And really all the value that gets created today in the technology space is really software driven from here on out. Almost every economic sector you can think of or I can think of is going to be disrupted, if it hasn't already, by the impact of mobile internet business models that are software driven, like the ones you see here on this list. Uber, just for example, the largest taxi company in the world, owns no cars. And we can go down through that list of all the different structures and business models that attack industries that are incredibly light in terms of their capital structures. Very different business and all software driven and very, very disruptive. And frankly, it's just beginning. If you look at where venture capitalists are focusing their efforts today, it's in, particularly in the small print that you see above the dotted line there. We're beginning to attack the education industry and certainly the healthcare industry in a variety of ways. You've read the headlines. It's big data, it's artificial intelligence, it's robotics, all software-driven businesses. If you take biotech in particular, for example, as computing speeds continue to advance, broadly speaking, in computing, the drug discovery process is accelerated right along with it. In fact, last year, venture capital-backed biotech companies dominated the IPO marketplace. It wasn't information technology, it was biotechs. And we saw the major pharma companies literally tripping all over each other to partner with some of these incredibly interesting nascent biotech startups that have created wonderfully scientific platforms designed to attack really important medical issues that affect us. And by the same token, again, beginning to turn this issue back on itself, these same dynamics have dramatically cut the cost of starting a company. It used to cost around $5 to $6 million to get a company up and running. Today, it's as low as, I don't think it's quite as low as $50,000 necessarily, depending on what sector you're attacking, but it's pretty darn low. And the reason for that is, in the old days, a startup had to purchase its computing capacity. It had to license proprietary software. It had to go off and hire a sales force. All of those issues today are handled via the internet, and often they're available to entrepreneurs for free. So what happens when things get really inexpensive? You get way, way more of them. And sure enough, the startup activity in the United States has just blown out of proportion since 2009. It's more than tripled in that time frame. And guess what? Because it's so inexpensive to start one of these companies, the angel and seed environment, seed funds have grown right along with those startups. But one thing I want to point out is at the bottom of this same chart is a light blue line that identifies the growth in what we call the early stage or A round type financiers in the venture space. And what you can see is they haven't grown along right along with the seed stage guys or with the startups. That's a problem that we might and a challenge that we'll get to in a few minutes. But first, let's look at the other end of the spectrum and exits. In the old days, and old days wasn't so long ago, a startup would get up and running. They would take a few rounds of financing, and once they got to $20, $30 million of revenues, they'd go public. And that was kind of the model, and it was easily done. And that was a great model until the tech bubble burst in 2001, and the IPO marketplace completely dried up, as did the investment banks that brought those companies public back in those days, the Robbie Stevens and the H&Qs. So fast forward, the venture capital community had to keep those businesses up and running. So how did they do it if they couldn't take them public and take advantage of public capital? Well, oops, I've gone one too far. Pardon me, I've spoiled the surprise. What really what they did was they had to go back to the well. They went to their existing investors and said, listen, guys, you've got to pony up. Keep funding these businesses, and one day they'll be big enough to go public. And thus, we saw the birth of what became known as the growth stage financing marketplace, and companies staying private longer. And that was a big change until they were mature enough to get public. And guess what? That gambit really worked because, as I previewed, lots of players are engaged in the growth side of things. There are funds that have been, that were at one time early stage managers that sort of morphed up into the growth stage area. Venture capitalists like it because they get to charge more management fees. Those late stage funds are bigger. That's always fun. And it wasn't long before the mutual funds and the hedge funds missing those IPOs decided to back their way back into the private market. So we have a lot of, some people call them tourists, but a lot of players who are in the marketplace that were not classic venture investors who are now funding these companies as they continue to grow very, very rapidly as private enterprises. Soon, we saw the biggest version of that was SoftBank, the huge Japanese mobile services provider that arrived a couple of years ago with this $100 billion vision fund, again, funding these businesses, encouraging them to stay private longer, grow under their watch, and essentially funding what amounted to a private IPO as opposed to a public IPO. So big shift in the marketplace. The implications for investors are as follows. Back in the day, companies like Cisco and Microsoft and Amazon all went public at valuations well below $1 billion. Since the emergence of the growth capital area, companies have stayed private. And if you look at the top 10 companies to go public last year, you'll see that all of them have gone public at least a valuation of $2 billion and generally significantly larger than that. All that valuation has accrued to the private investors, not the public investors. So one thing to take away here, I suppose, is that it pays to be a private investor these days. So a little allocation to the private markets doesn't hurt so much. Just fast forwarding to what we expect to see this year, 2019, there is a pretty significant crop of very, very well-known companies to all of us here. The Ubers, Lyfts, Palantir, Stripe, et cetera. Uber all by itself, if you believe its bankers, could go public at a $120 billion valuation. The last time we saw anything like that was Facebook. So what we've seen in the marketplace is a real segmentation, I would say. We now have a very robust seed market. We have a very robust growth capital market. And we have the continuation of what was the classic, fairly early stage, relatively small fund group that we would call right-sized venture capital funds. As we think about it today, if you asked us, we would say that the capital at the seed stage end and at the growth stage end is fairly undifferentiated. That is, there's not a lot that comes with it beyond money. But, and so I think it's understandable why those have grown as much as they have. However, the venture capital end, that sort of early stage side of the marketplace, is still a pretty tough market. It's tough to break in and gain capital if you're a startup company in that area. And frankly, it's those managers that have incredible experience in this space, who are good at nurturing businesses, that really turbocharge many of these businesses that then go on and get a growth stage financing. So I would say it's no wonder that, given that skill set is so hard to come by, that this is the venture capital end, the true early stage venture capital end, is the bottleneck in the financing chain for startups in this marketplace. And so you could see some investors who would say, you know, the more things change, the more they do stay the same. That early stage end of the marketplace, that right-sized fund category is where we like to focus. And you'll see them saying that because if you take a look here at performance, those venture-sized funds, typically early stage focused, moderately sized, with experienced investor teams, continue to outperform as they always have. Here you see that the vast majority of the top quartile performers, those are the blue portions of the bars here, are the ones that are most likely to fall into that top quartile. They are made up mostly by those fund managers that are running programs somewhere between $50 million and $400 million, typically. Bigger than angels and smaller than the growth funds. So are all those great funds still located in Silicon Valley? Or has venture capital really, truly gone global? I'm getting ahead of myself, pardon me. If you look at where the unicorns are, those venture-backed companies that are still private and valued at more than $1 billion each, you'd look and say, oh, it's gone completely global. 45 unicorns today, or at least when we last checked, in Asia, principally China. Or are those business models that have evolved in those other markets really just been copycats of internet models that were really originated here in the United States? Or to ask it another way, where is the true and important innovation actually taking place around the globe in the information technology area? And as we think about that and we go a little bit closer to home, we look at, I suppose the good news is that investment has tripled over the last decade in places outside of the classic venture capital locations like Silicon Valley, like Boston, and like New York. In fact, New York, I would say, is one of the classic emerging venture funds. It wasn't always a great venture areas. It was not always a strong venture center. It has become one, and it gives hope to other regions as well. But guess what? When you look more broadly, you can see that capital has flowed into this industry everywhere, and those three primary marketplaces, New York, Boston, and Silicon Valley, continue to dominate in terms of the amount of capital that flows. But it is important to recognize that there's much more capital available for startups broadly across the United States. So what does it take for one of those, one of the non-principal centers to steal that innovation marketplace and market share? I'd posit a few things. You need a variety of variables available in a location, concentrated, to establish oneself as a venture capital hub. An example is a source of innovation. You need universities, institutes, incubators, accelerators. Guess what? Houston's got them. So you can check the box on that one. Source of talent. It helps to have large tech companies that you can pull really good technology talent out of. The world is, almost every company in the world, we're going to talk about this later today, almost every industry and every company in the world is going to be a tech company at some point. And they're on their way to being such. And I think there's plenty of tech talent here, particularly in the oil and gas industry, and the pharmaceutical industry, and in the research hospital area, to, again, be at least the nascent part of growing an important source of talent in this market. You need a source of entrepreneurs, and there isn't a more risk-taking culture anywhere than there is right here in Houston. You've got that in spades. So the first three boxes look like they're kind of well covered. You need a source of credibility, and really what that means is you need some examples of success, and then they have to build on themselves. That does take time. You also need a source of just support services. You need local venture capital. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Rob. You need a variety of other skill sets that are there. But by the way, Houston has a very vibrant private equity marketplace, and so a lot of the services that support private equity also are in place to support an emerging venture capital ecosystem. By the way, a shout out to Cap Street. We love that fund in our business, if you know anybody there. You need a source of differentiation. This is a key one. You got to compete for talent against other potential hubs, other places that are trying to grow technology communities just the way you are. And the fact is you just have to have special expertise. You have to brag about it. You've got to brag about the quality of life here. And I think there are ways to accomplish that too. So it takes time, perhaps a generation, but there's no reason why Houston can't emerge as an important technology center long term. I've used up almost more than all my time. But I want to say just one thing's for sure. We are in a world that is seeing powerful tech-driven paradigm shifts in almost every aspect of our lives, whether working or personal. It's driven, these shifts are driving the venture capital market, but in turn, the venture capital market is the financial engine and the financial lifeblood for all of these evolutions. I will say that many of the things you see here on the bottom part of this chart, what stays the same? Many of the basics of the venture business really haven't changed. The rules of successful investing really are pretty much in place. Yes, Silicon Valley continues to dominate, But innovation isn't captive there. We're seeing centers emerge in Europe, certainly in Israel, to some degree in Asia, and closer to home. Can Houston become one of them? I think it certainly can, and if and when it does, we'll have the people on this panel right here to thank. Thank you all for a little introductory remarks.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it. Good job. Good overview. So speaking of local venture capital, part of Houston Exponential's challenge is bringing in venture capital in a way that makes sense. We do have some first-class venture capital here, but we needed more. So there's a parallel organization to Houston Exponential called the HX Venture Fund. It's a fund of funds. We're raising money to this day right now. We've already raised $25 million, and it is money that we invest in venture funds around the country to come back here. We have had huge contributions from Houston's leaders, Chevron, Shell, Waste Management. The fund is still open, and if you're interested, Sandy Wallace is right back here, and she is with the fund. And that's my last Houston Exponential commercial for today. So up next, let's go to Blair Garrou. Blair Garrou, who had a hand in the formation and founding of Houston Exponential, the co-founder and managing director of Mercury Fund. Why don't you give us an overview first of Mercury Fund, Blair?
Yeah, sure. Real briefly. So we are one of those early stage venture funds that Peter talked about that's kind of right in the middle. So we come into a company when they're about a $500,000 revenue run rate, and we help them build and scale their business to about a 10 to 20 million run rate, and then we go out and look for more growth equity to take those companies forward. What's unique about our fund is we only work with entrepreneurs who innovate in the middle of the country. And we aren't necessarily looking for disruptive technologies like you hear about on the coast. We like to work with corporates like Shell and P&G and GE and understand what's going to make them more innovative and efficient. We think the middle of the country is going to be driven by innovation that helps those corporates move forward and compete on a global scale and with the innovation that's done on the coasts. And we've been doing that now for about 15 years. And I think to echo one of the things that Russ said, for years, Mercury Fund has been the largest and one of the only VCs in Houston. Most of the other venture capital that flows in Houston comes from corporate venture groups, most associated with energy, or much smaller groups. And so for years, we've only put about 10 to 15% of our capital to work in Houston, much of it in other areas like Indianapolis, Chicago, Austin, and Denver. And so the fact that there's hopefully going to be another 15 to 20 Mercury-like organizations in Houston, you'll start to see a lot more deal flow through the system, and that'll really, I think, push innovation.
Thank you, Blair. Okay, I want to encourage questions from the audience on the written early. I don't like to get to the end and have a stack that we can't through, so Jen's going to be bringing them up if you have some, so please bring them up. And next up, let's go to David Schubert, the Chief Operating Partner with Accelerator Life Sciences Partners. David, give us an overview.
Accelerator Life Science Partners is a firm that was formed in 2001 in Seattle, has offices in New York City, San Diego. We invest in early stage life science technologies, preferably therapeutics. We recently invested in a company that we spun out of along with MD Anderson, a company called Magnolia Neurosciences, focusing on chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathies and neurodegeneration. Our LPs, we approach the world a little bit differently. Our LPs are global pharmaceutical companies, Eli Lilly, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and AbbVie. And we utilize their talent to help us screen deals and have a potential buyer sitting at the table. And so Magnolia has a presence here in Houston in that we received a $20 million grant from the Cancer Prevention Research Institute for Texas. So we've developed infrastructure here to support the clinical work that will begin next year here in the state of Texas.
Thanks a lot. So even though Peter left the stage, we still have a major representative with Aberdeen Standard Investments. And in fact, on the questions, Peter will still be available for questions. But Kirsten, Morin, tell us about Aberdeen Standard Investments.
Sure. So Peter and I manage the venture capital strategy at Aberdeen. Our focus is on early stage, principally technology-oriented venture capital managers globally. And we manage capital principally via a fund-of-funds structure where we invest on behalf of our clients, which are large family offices, smaller institutions. And, we are doing our best where venture capital often represents a smaller piece of one's asset allocation to help our clients access the innovation that Peter just described and some of the trends of companies staying private longer and whatnot.
Thanks. I couldn't help but notice in Peter's presentation, and this is for all of you, but I know for sure, Blair, that the startup costs have plummeted. And he talked about how, you don't have to buy the systems like you used to, but you don't even need a business plan anymore. Isn't that right? It's just a PowerPoint? Do I have that right?
Yeah, no, if somebody sends a business plan over, we ignore it. It's a waste of time because with cheap launching of startups, entrepreneurs now are taught to fail fast. Take your invention, take it to market, let the market determine the winners, and very quickly, as you get market acceptance, then look for capital to kind of take it forward. Very, very different than 20 years ago when I got started in the business, where you were going to sit and plan and put a plan in place and get funding for that. Now you actually want to see traction before you put money into a company.
Yeah, I never got that memo about failing fast, so I failed over a long period of time instead. So what about the two of you? I mean, do you even do startups? I mean, sort of.
So, yeah, I mean, we tend to actually form the entities themselves, so we're out looking at institutions for technologies, and it is not that we haven't invested in companies that actually existed before, but we haven't invested in ones that have taken money from other parties, and I agree with Blair, like a business plan in early stage biotech therapeutics investing is not really worth the price of the paper that it's printed on. Cancer, big market, got that. But at the stage that you're investing, what's written in the business plan means nothing about where the direction the laboratory is going to take you.
Anything to add?
Not on the business plan per se, but what I would say is that the capital efficiency gains in recent years have been a brilliant development for venture capital because entrepreneurs are failing quicker with less capital, which means that write-off rates in the industry have plummeted, and thus, the returns in venture have been far better than they had in past cycles. So it's been a very positive development that you can de-risk things very quickly with very little capital.
If I might add to that, in the life sciences, I really like the slide saying startup is 50. You get a startup going for $50,000. Not in therapeutics. We budget $30,000 per employee the day they start for the stuff that we have to buy for them. But I agree that part of things the efficiency is improving in life sciences because of disciplined investing at the venture level. I mean, failing fast and knowing when you're not hitting milestones and shutting down that investment is becoming far higher levels of discipline you're seeing rather than trying to drag things on and maybe we'll hit on something. It's much easier these days and much more acceptable to give up. Peter Drucker always said giving up is one of the hardest things to do, but when you're not hitting your milestones in a life science company, the data's not there, you're not putting in any more money.
Okay. So, and I think this is mainly just for you, Kirsten. I mean, being a global venture capital firm, I mean, are you truly global, investing all over the world?
We are. So our principal emphasis is on Silicon Valley-focused firms, just given that is where the lion's share of returns historically have come from. But we believe that there are pockets of innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystems that are sprouting up globally, and thus our portfolio needs to reflect those trends. And so we invest in Asia, in Europe, in Israel, in New York City, et cetera.
Okay. So here's a question from the audience. What is the best way for traditional modest-sized family offices to access this asset class? I say see Sandy Wallace over here. She can help you out. Yeah. No, do you guys have an answer?
I certainly have an opinion that's probably much like Sandy's. That, I think that's our reason to exist as a fund-to-fund structure. And we love telling the story of Mark Zuckerberg, right? When he was at Harvard and had the idea for Facebook, he shopped the idea around in Waltham, and people passed on the opportunity because they thought that his valuation was asked for a social platform that was just on a few local college campuses. He went to the West Coast and shopped it again up and down Sand Hill Road, and finally Excel Partners bit. Jim Breyer at Excel Partners took the bait and invested $10 million for 10% of his company at a $100 million valuation, and the rest is history. But there was a relatively equivalent chance that Series A investment could have landed in any given manager's portfolio that had a leading reputation. And I think that our our learnings and experience has been that it's not the same fund manager over and over that generates the leading returns. You know, there's a relatively small group of managers who are responsible for the lion's share of industry returns. The returns are concentrated in venture and even single companies. But, you know, it's very difficult to take a rifle shot approach. And for most folks, particularly a modest-sized family office, where it's a small piece of your allocation, you know, we think that having a somewhat diversified portfolio makes a lot of sense.
Great. David, you mentioned your recent investment in this Magnolia company. I've heard you describe it in detail. I think it'd be of interest to the audience.
So Magnolia Neuroscience is a company that was created out of technology developed by a group of investigators at MD Anderson and a group called IACS, the Institute for Advanced Cancer Studies. And for those of you that aren't overly familiar with how drug development works in a normal academic setting, what MD Anderson has created is by and far very unique in that they have brought in a group of about 100 really trained drug hunters, ex-Merck, Pfizer, et cetera, and they are developing drugs for cancer applications at MD Anderson, and then they are out-licensing them sometimes to startups, sometimes to big pharma. And so we invested along with MD Anderson about $31 million to move this technology forward on both fronts, in both chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathies. So for those of you who that don't know what peripheral neuropathies are, it's kind of like when your leg falls asleep if you're sitting funny and kind of get that tingly feeling and you can't walk. Or people that have diabetic neuropathies, it's the inabilities to being able to feel your limbs. Cancer patients, particularly ones that are heavily dosed with platinum-based agents, so for example, breast cancer, colorectal cancer, and ovarian cancers, often develop neuropathies as they're undergoing treatment. About 30% of the patients then develop enough of the neuropathies that they don't have a quality of life that they deem acceptable. Lots of falls and such, and so that just magnifies the problem, and so patients are then going back to their doctors and asking them to back off their chemotherapy treatments in order to preserve a quality of life. And so there's a niche identified there where if we could be able to protect the patient's nerves from from the chemotherapeutic assault, but still get the abilities to have the chemotherapeutic agent work, there's an opportunity there for treating patients. And so, again, we are also a recipient of a Cancer Prevention Research Institute of Texas grant of $20 million that we match on a 2-for-1 basis. And so we're putting a lot of money to work in locally developed technologies and clinically testing here in Texas.
Impressive. I think this one's for you, Blair. How do you feel about MassChallenge coming to Houston? You might first describe MassChallenge to those that don't know what it is.
Yeah, sure. So many of you may be familiar with an accelerator concept, and an accelerator is essentially a program for startups where it takes a startup, about 10 of them, and for 3 months they go through a learning program to get that startup from kind of idea formation to actually a basic product or a minimum viable product, as they call it. And then they present to investors and hopefully get seed capital and kind of move forward. These accelerators, that program really was started by a group called Y Combinator on the West Coast, and then a group called Techstars that many of you probably heard of. Well, MassChallenge is a very large, almost global call for business plans and ideas to try to do this on a localized basis. And so MassChallenge has a number of international locations, and they're actually putting their next location here in Houston. So to your question, Russ, how do I feel about MassChallenge coming? You know, for a lot of us in the community, and I see John Reale out there, one of the co-founders of Station, again, a co-working accelerator where you build density around startups that are all hanging out together. We can talk about that in a minute. We need a dozen, if not 100 types of programs here in Houston to move entrepreneurs forward. And something like MassChallenge, which isn't necessarily energy or healthcare specific, it may look at any type of entrepreneur endeavor. It's going to help those entrepreneurs that may come out of a vertical or an opportunity that we're not even seeing coming. You know, for years, everyone said, hey, Houston should really focus on entrepreneurism or innovation within the energy vertical or within the healthcare vertical. But if you think about Houston's greatest strength, it's not necessarily energy or healthcare, it's diversity. And if your strength is diversity, then you have to allow ideas just to flourish. And I think this is what MassChallenge is going to do, Russ.
Great. Kirsten, I'm just interested in Aberdeen Standard Investments. Give me just a perspective of maybe a couple of favorites of yours in your portfolio today.
Of the companies?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. So I think as we turned the corner to 2019, all eyes are on the next generation companies that are mature enough to pursue a public market offering. So we're paying a lot of attention to how the market receives Uber and Lyft and Pinterest and Airbnb and some lesser known companies like Cloudflare, which, well, most people haven't heard of it, is actually behind the scenes of websites protecting against denial of service attacks, and is a really important piece of enterprise security technology. And so those are some of the ones I would say that are mature in our portfolio that we're quite keen to see how they're harvested. But I think what's probably more interesting is seeing around the corner to where technology is going and how it's shaping wide industry verticals. We've been talking a lot about insurance, and so there's a lot of companies that are disrupting the insurance and other areas of the financial markets. One that's been interesting to watch in our portfolio is a company called Lemonade, which is geared towards Henrys, the high earners not rich yet, and seeks to provide them with rental insurance first, and makes quick decisions around claims that they may have. And they were remarkably quick to get regulatory approval from surprising sources. So that's one that I have found interesting, and I think there's a lot of development in the areas around blockchain and crypto assets. We have been exploring and actually have invested in 2 managers that are looking a lot at blockchain-related assets. And then, of course, autonomy is another sector that's gotten a lot of interest, along with artificial intelligence and machine learning. So.
Cool. There's actually some kind of interesting, I think, still confidential autonomy taking place in Houston right now, too. So, David, so, you've been, I mean, your company's just way on the upper end of health tech, but what do you think of what's going on here now? TMCX, the Johnson & Johnson CDI, which is pretty cool, JLabs. What's your perspective on that?
So, I mean, I lived in Houston and worked for Rice University from 2012 till January of 2015, and in the time that has passed since I first arrived, there's been a dramatic amount of progress that has been made here, particularly in the life science. Russ mentioned a few, certainly TMCX and attracting someone like JLabs and then the CDI to really take on the face of an incredibly talented entrepreneur, Billy Cohn, who's been an innovator in cardiovascular device development for years, is a real kudos to the city. The opposite side of that is that this is not a 5-year plan, and it's not a 7-year plan, and it's not a 15-year plan. It's a 30-year plan to make this city relevant in drug development. Certainly, this city has its capabilities. Particularly, what comes to mind is in cell therapy, where you have drugs that have been approved. So for companies this is a concept where you're utilizing a patient's own cells to genetically modify them and return them back to the patient. This is an area called CAR T cells, and MD Anderson is a dramatic developer of these programs. There's companies, for example, Kite Therapeutics was bought by Gilead for $12 billion. Juno Therapeutics was bought by Celgene for $10 billion. This is an area where, in this area of development, Houston has really excelled, largely due to the work of Malcolm Brenner at Baylor College of Medicine. And then you see drug manufacturers like Lonza, invest hundreds of millions of dollars in a plant in Pearland where they're developing and manufacturing cellular therapies on the basis of on the needs for their clients. And because these manufacturing aspects are complicated and also require a massive amount of infrastructure, having someone else make them is far more beneficial than trying to develop that infrastructure yourself. But certainly there's reasons to be excited about what's happening here, but we are still early on in the process.
Thanks. You mentioned Billy Cohn. I mean, what they're doing in CDI and what he's doing with Bud Fraser's invention with the continuous flow, totally implantable artificial heart is over the top. This is a turbine-driven pump for artificial heart, meaning you don't have a pulse afterwards. So kind of cool. Okay, we're starting to run out of time. Would still welcome a couple of more questions from the audience. And if you haven't written cursive in about 10 years, try not to do it again. But here, meaning help me. Yeah. I'm going to need some. Interpretation. Yeah.
I'll try. Texas wealthy families and business owners frequently prefer options to pursue deals case by case, common in the oil and gas space and real estate world. But in the IT and biotech venture capital space, is this the right way to go?
Oh, I'd like to take that one.
Go for it.
You got it.
So it is very, very hard to raise a fund in this town to not do oil and gas or real estate. And the reason is, most of the groups that either you represent or that you do your own deals, right? You're very versed at doing your own deals in oil and gas. In oil and gas, with net profits interest and how you structure them, they're some of the more, say, complex deals that are out there. And so doing something like a software company, enterprise software, or something in life sciences seems relatively easily. And this has gone on for years. And I tend to believe that over the last 20 years, one of the reasons that we haven't really pushed the ball forward is because there's been a lot of private capital that's moved into these companies that hasn't necessarily been helpful capital, because you just don't necessarily do it for a living from a standpoint of software companies or from life science companies. And I remember in 1998, 99, we were getting the Houston Technology Center off the ground. We formed the Houston Angel Network, brought a lot of high net worth individuals together, and a lot of money poured into a lot of these seed stage enterprises. And the dot-com boost came, everyone lost all their money, and the money dried up for like 4 or 5 years. And now we're starting to see another resurgence of private capital going into localized deals. And I think it's just really, really difficult. If I ever do an oil and gas deal or a real estate deal, I tend to either go into a fund or I invest behind an operator or somebody else who's actually pushing my investment forward. And I think that's been something that's been really challenging for Houston. If you look at other markets like Boston or Silicon Valley, it's kind of a doubling effect where everyone is from the industry, so they understand the industry, and that kind of moves it forward. And so, one of the questions that came in before, how do you best get access to this? I'm not necessarily saying you should invest in Mercury Fund, but to get to the really big deals, those unicorns you read about like Uber and those, the only people that have access to those deals are really the Aberdeens and other groups out there like Aberdeen. And if you want to invest in a fund, you really should be investing in, say, 3 to 4 funds on a balanced basis and look at doing that. But one of the things, Russ, that you've been working on at Houston Exponential is how do we educate angels more to invest in groups, to put the structures actually more simply. Like venture is actually one of the most simple, structured deal mechanisms there are, and a lot of times we'll see family offices structure a deal for a startup, and we can't even invest afterwards because of the actual structure. And it sounds odd, but it's just a very, very simple industry, and I think more education out there will help.
Okay.
Can I pile on
Sure,
to that
absolutely.
for 1 second? So I think venture capital, at its core, it's risk capital. So you're expecting a binary outcome. It could be good, it could be bad. But I think, as you think about investing in a case-by-case basis in some of these deals, I would refer back to the chart that Peter showed where you saw this explosion of seed stage activity because it got so cheap to start a company. But the Series A capital, like the Mercuries of the world and others, it didn't follow suit, right? They're not going to increase the velocity of their investment pace at the early stage, right? So I think you're seeing a concentration of the capital in the winning companies, if you will. So I still think it's very difficult to take a rifle shot approach to seed stage investing because of the binary nature of VC.
One thing I have seen over time are when family offices will bind together and they'll find a manager that they then can back into a new fund, or they invest in a fund early and get part of the general partner carry, so get improved economics, but to where there's actually more direction and you actually get an amplified effect. But you're getting those portfolio economics by investing in a broad array of companies than more. And groups that have done that here locally, I think, have had pretty good success.
Your comments on early stage and really more specifically angel investing with the startup costs going down and so forth, does that mean that, and there might be statistics on this that I don't even know about, but does that mean there's a lot more angel investing now? And is angel investing as a whole more successful than it used to be?
There is a lot. When we started Mercury 15 years ago, we were seed stage, same stage as angels. Mm-hmm. And we don't do seed stage anymore because there's no need. There's so much angel capital now. I mean, think about it. The last 10 years since Shark Tank debuted, the entire nation wants to be a shark, right? They want to put capital to work. And that's great because that means groups like us can just sit back and wait for those great deals for the market to determine the winner. And for them to pop along, and then you pounce on the ones that actually have that market traction. But I don't know the exact statistics, but I know in the mid-continent there's at least 5 to 8 times more angel investment now than there was just 5 or 6 years ago, and that's a lot of capital.
Yeah, if you rewind back to before the financial crisis, there were 40 or so micro VC funds that took outside institutional capital. And fast forward to today, there's 600 plus such groups out there. So I think that'll give you a sense for just how dynamic and how much fund formation there's been. But the successful ones have migrated a bit upstream.
Okay, I think we're almost out of time, unless they want us to go over time. I don't know if they do. Probably not. So if each of you want to give it was crickets. If any of you want to sort of give, there might be potential investors in your funds. Maybe you don't need investors, but why don't you each just give a description that might answer that question for anybody here in the audience?
Yeah, sure. So we are in the process of closing our fourth fund, 125 million in commitments. 80 to 90% of our fund is institutional capital, so endowments, foundations, pension funds, and about 10 to 15% is family office and high net worth. When you start a fund, you pretty much raise high net worth and family office capital, and as you get larger, you basically move to institution just to kind of keep it stable. But Houston's been great. Probably 10 to 20% of the family offices in town have invested with us, throughout the years, and they've been great. One of the things too is you're thinking about investing in a fund because you do like the direct investments, and part of it is because it's unencumbered, right? You're not paying a fee, you're not paying a carry, and that's the real reason to do it. Look for funds that give you direct access to those deals, maybe on a side-by-side basis. There's a lot of funds coming in Houston now because of their size. They allow for that, and that's a great way to get some of the unencumbered assets in your portfolio, but have it managed by someone else where you're not being called upon for those capital calls all the time on a direct basis.
Great. David?
We're in the process of a first close on a fund that we hope to have done by the end of the second quarter. It'll include a variety of strategic investors as well as traditional venture capital investors. We may be looking to family offices as part of a second close. I would say, kind of going back to the question as to how do you do one-off deals in biotech, I would say, one, good luck, and second, don't do it. These things biotech is really, really complicated. Unless you have a group of people on your staff or that you can engage that really understand the space, it's a very hard spot to be in unless you're really, truly, wedded into the industry and what's happening. And that's kind of why we've taken the structure that we've taken with our strategics and venture funds that focus specifically on biotech and therapeutic investments.
So we are likewise in market. So we are raising our 11th fund. We're about 2/3 of the way towards our target. It's a small, modest-sized fund to execute our strategy of targeting a concentrated group of early-stage, principally technology-oriented fund managers globally. And it's a mix between the franchise names that are you'd know and recognize, and different groups that have become franchises over the last 10 years by way of their affiliation with some of the leading tech companies today. So,
thank you, Kirsten. Kirsten affected me from the beginning when I saw her undergrad was at Babson, right?
Yeah.
And there's another Babson guy in here too, JR.
Oh, very good.
All right, let's hear it for our panel. These guys are great. Thank you all very much.